Imagine a man who wore the crowns of 3 different nations, ruling over the frozen reaches of the north with an iron hand, only to end his days as a pirate, raiding the very merchant ships that once bowed to his banners. This is not a myth, nor a fable from a lost era of fiction. This is the true story of Eric of Pomerania, the king of the north who traded his throne for a life of high seas plunder.
To understand how a man falls from the pinnacle of European royalty to the decks of a pirate ship, we have to go back to the year 1382 in the Duchy of Pomerania along the southern coast of the Baltic Sea. He was born Bogislaw, the son of Duke Wardislaw VII. By all accounts, he was a child of noble blood, but he was never meant to rule a vast empire.
Fate, however, had a very different plan, and it came in the form of a woman who would become one of the most powerful figures in medieval history, Queen Margaret I of Denmark. Margaret was a visionary, a woman who sought to unite the warring kingdoms of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden into a single, unstoppable superpower. But Margaret had a problem. She had no direct heir. Her only son had died young, leaving a vacuum at the heart of her grand design. She looked across the sea to her young grandnephew, Bogislaw. She saw in the young boy not just a relative, but a vessel for her ambition. At the age of 6, the boy was brought to Denmark. His name was changed from the Slavic Bogislaw to the more Scandinavian Eric, and he was groomed for a destiny that was almost too large for any one man to carry. In 1397, the dream became a reality. At the city of Kalmar, the 3 kingdoms were officially joined in what we now call the Kalmar Union. Eric, still just a teenager, was crowned king of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. On paper, he was the master of the north, the ruler of a territory stretching from the fjords of Norway to the forests of Finland.
But for the next 15 years, he was a king in name only. Margaret was the true power behind the throne, the architect of the union, who handled the diplomacy, the finances, and the internal politics. Eric was the apprentice, watching from the shadows as his great-aunt navigated the treacherous waters of medieval power.
When Margaret died in 1412, the training wheels were ripped off. Eric of Pomerania was finally the sole ruler of the Kalmar Union. He was tall, handsome, and possessed a voice that was said to be so powerful it could command a room of 100 shouting men. He was an eloquent speaker and a man of high culture, but he was also headstrong, stubborn, and lacked the subtle diplomatic touch that had made Margaret so successful. Eric's reign was defined by his obsession with 2 things, the Duchy of Schleswig and the dominance of the Baltic Sea. For years, he poured the blood and treasure of his 3 kingdoms into a brutal, grinding war against the Counts of Holstein and the Hanseatic League, the powerful confederation of merchant guilds that controlled the trade routes of Northern Europe. To fund his endless wars, Eric made a move that would change European history for the next 400 years. In 1429, he introduced the Sound Dues. He demanded that every single ship passing through the narrow Øresund Strait, the primary gateway between the North Sea and the Baltic, pay a toll to the Danish crown. It was a stroke of genius, turning a natural bottleneck into a gold mine. But it was also a declaration of war against the merchants of Europe. While Eric was away at war or traveling across Europe to seek allies, his wife, Philippa of England, often ruled in his stead. Philippa, the daughter of King Henry IV, was a remarkable woman, pious, intelligent, and arguably more beloved by the people than Eric himself. She defended Copenhagen against a massive Hanseatic fleet while her husband was elsewhere, proving herself a capable military leader. When she died in 1430, Eric lost his greatest advisor and his strongest link to the loyalty of his subjects. From that point on, things began to unravel. The Swedish nobility in particular had grown tired of Eric. They felt his wars were Danish wars, fought with Swedish money and Swedish blood. They resented the foreign officials he placed in high positions and the heavy taxes he levied to pay for his fortresses and fleets. In 1434, a massive peasant rebellion broke out in Sweden, led by a mine owner named Engelbrekt Engelbrektsson.
It was the beginning of the end. Eric's reaction to the rebellion was typical of his character. He was stubborn. He refused to compromise, refused to listen to the grievances of his council, and eventually he simply walked away. In a move that shocked the royal courts of Europe, Eric abandoned Denmark and retreated to the island of Gotland, taking with him a significant portion of the royal treasury. He believed that by absenting himself, the kingdoms would realize they couldn't survive without him and would beg for his return on his terms. He was wrong. In 1439, the Danish Council of the Realm officially deposed him. Sweden and Norway followed suit shortly after. They offered the crown to his nephew, Christopher of Bavaria. Eric, the man who had been the king of the north, was now a king without a country. But Eric of Pomerania was not the type of man to go quietly into the night.
From his massive fortress of Visborg on the island of Gotland, Eric began the second and perhaps most infamous chapter of his life. He turned to piracy. For the next 10 years, the former king of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden became the most feared man in the Baltic Sea. He didn't see himself as a common criminal. He saw himself as a legitimate ruler extracting what was rightfully his. He commanded a fleet of ships and a garrison of loyal men, launching devastating raids on Hanseatic merchant vessels. He disrupted the very trade routes he had once sought to protect. When asked how he could justify such a life, he famously replied that he was simply earning a living. It was a surreal sight for the era. A man who had been anointed by the church and crowned in a cathedral was now living the life of a corsair, selling plundered silks and spices in the markets of Visby. He held Gotland as a private pirate kingdom, a thorn in the side of the new Scandinavian kings and the Hanseatic merchants alike. Eventually, the pressure became too great. In 1449, after a decade of maritime insurgency, Eric reached an agreement with the new Swedish king. He surrendered the fortress of Visborg and the island of Gotland in exchange for safe passage back to his ancestral home in Pomerania. He returned to the land of his birth not as a king, but as a duke, spending his final years in the city of Rügenwalde. He lived for another 10 years, a relic of a vanished era, the last living link to the glory days of Queen Margaret's union. When he died in 1459, he was buried in the Church of St. Mary in Rügenwalde. His tomb remains there to this day, a quiet end for a man whose life was defined by the roar of cannons and the crashing of waves. The legacy of Eric of Pomerania is a complex one. He is often remembered as a failure, the man who allowed the Kalmar Union to fracture and who lost 3 kingdoms through sheer arrogance. But history is rarely that simple. His introduction of the sound dues remained a cornerstone of the Danish economy for centuries, funding the rise of Denmark as a major European power. But more than his political achievements, it is the image of the pirate king that captures our imagination. He was a man who refused to accept his downfall, a monarch who decided that if he could not rule the land, he would rule the sea. He proved that a crown is just a piece of gold, and that true power lies in the will of the man who wears it, or the man who casts it aside to take up the sword. Subscribe for more.